I woke up that morning feeling oddly refreshed, ready to tackle another busy day. The early sunlight beamed through the blinds, casting warm stripes on the bedroom wall. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. But that peace evaporated the second I looked outside and realized my car wasn't there. Not in front of the house, not in the driveway, nowhere. I stood there in my pajamas, heart thumping so hard I could practically hear it echo, while 1,000 questions roared through my mind. Had it been stolen? Towed for some bizarre reason? Was there some kind of emergency I didn't know about? I hurried outside, the grass damp under my bare feet as I surveyed the driveway. No broken glass, no sign of forced entry, no tire skid marks that might hint at a thief peeling away in the night. It was like my car had just vanished into thin air. Confused, I circled around, my pulse still pounding, trying to recall if I'd parked it somewhere else or maybe left it at a friend's house. But no, I specifically remembered coming home late, pulling into my driveway as usual and locking the doors. It made no sense. Then I spotted a slip of paper pinned to my front door, flapping gently in the mild breeze. Before I even plucked it off, a sense of dread welled in my stomach. Notice of removal, vehicle TOWD4 HOA violation. The words, printed in heavy black letters, stared back at me. My mind reeled. An HOA violation. In my own driveway, that was where I always parked. I tore open the folded paper, scanning it for details. It was some half-baked explanation about unaesthetic vehicles being in violation of property standards. Something about them having the right to remove any vehicle, posing a threat to the harmonious appearance of the neighborhood. I felt a bubble of anger rise in my throat. This was outrageous. My sedan was practically new. It wasn't rusted out or covered in dents. It was just a normal, perfectly operational car. Who decided it was a threat to the neighborhood's appearance? Welcome, everyone, to another dramatic Taleflow story. If you enjoy hearing about stubborn HOA Karens who take their power trips way too far, and if you want to see them get a serious taste of justice, then stick around. I promise you, this story is loaded with enough twists and turns to keep you hooked until the very end, and let me tell you, the comeuppance is oh so satisfying. Before I dive into the shocking details, I want to invite you to like this video, subscribe to Taleflow for more wild HOA Karen showdowns, and drop a comment if you've ever had a neighbor or an HOA official try to run your life in ways that defy all logic. Trust me, your support helps keep these stories coming, and I'd love to hear about your personal experiences with petty, power-hungry types. Now, let's jump back into this insane saga. I'll never forget how my hands shook as I clutched that notice. My day, once calm, had taken a wild turn for the worse. Right then, I had to figure out if the car was simply towed somewhere I could retrieve it from, or if something more serious was afoot. The notice said it had been taken to a local impound lot, courtesy of the Homeowners Association directive. Usually, impound lots hold onto your car until you pay a fine or towing fees. But what in the world had I done to deserve a fine in my own driveway? I'd heard rumors about our HOA's new president, someone folks simply referred to as Karen. She was well known for her relentless crusade to maintain the perfect curb appeal of every house in the neighborhood. Rumor had it she measured grass lengths with a ruler, scolded people for having the wrong type of mulch in their flower beds, and even confronted a neighbor for leaving their recycling bin out by the curb a day too early. She was, by all accounts, the ultimate busybody, living for the thrill of handing out warnings and fines like candy on Halloween. Still, I never imagined she'd stoop to towing a perfectly legal, properly registered car from someone's personal driveway without so much as a phone call. Rather than making frantic calls from the house, I hopped into a rideshare and headed straight to the address listed on the notice. The impound lot was a chain-link surrounded yard on the outskirts of town, near an industrial district that always smelled faintly of motor oil. My driver dropped me off near a small shack at the entrance, where a bored-looking clerk sat behind a grimy window. I showed her the HOA notice, expecting a typical process: pay the fee, fill out some forms, drive away. But the clerk stared at me like I was clueless. "That car's not here," she said in a flat voice. "The HOA had it towed, yeah, but they said it was up for immediate sale." My jaw practically hit the floor. "Sale, as in sold?" I asked, struggling to keep my composure. Tow companies often keep vehicles for a few weeks before auctioning them, giving the owner time to reclaim their property. That's standard practice. The clerk shrugged and reiterated, "It's not here anymore. We just do the towing. You might want to contact your HOA." Then she tapped her nails on the counter, clearly ready to move on. A mixture of rage and disbelief coursed through me. Usually, to even begin the process of selling a vehicle, there has to be a certain waiting period, an attempt to contact the owner, or at least an official municipal regulation that deems the car abandoned on public property. But in my own driveway, I was speechless. The short ride back home felt like hours, my head churning with questions and potential solutions. This went beyond a simple towing. It felt like grand theft. Who gave the HOA the right to confiscate and sell a resident's vehicle? My phone started buzzing nonstop. Friends and neighbors who'd seen the tow truck the night before were sending messages. "Hey, I saw them towing your car. Is everything okay? I can't believe the HOA did that," and so on. I appreciated the support, but it only fueled my frustration. The dreaded moment arrived when I realized I'd need to call the HOA's main line to see if I could get a hold of Karen directly, so I did. A brisk female voice answered, "Homeowners Association office, how may I direct your call?" "I need to speak to Karen," I said, forcing calmness. The line clicked, then a voice came on that I recognized instantly from the handful of times she'd left condescending messages in our neighborhood's group chat. "Hello, this is Karen, HOA president," she said, her tone laced with smug confidence. "And who might I be speaking with?" "It's me," I said, giving my name and stating my address. "I'm calling about my car. It was towed from my own driveway last night without any warning." "Oh yes," she responded, not missing a beat. "We deemed that vehicle in violation of our aesthetic standards. As stated in the revised neighborhood guidelines, all vehicles must adhere to the style and condition expectations set by the HOA board. Yours did not meet those guidelines, so we had it removed." Her explanation dripped with artificial politeness, a veneer of calm that only made me angrier. "Condition? My car is barely 2 years old. There's nothing unsightly about it. Why didn't I get any warning or a fine or something normal, like a notice stuck on my mailbox?" She exhaled in an exaggerated fashion. "We sent out multiple memos. If you chose not to read them, that's your responsibility. The guidelines are quite clear. If a homeowner's vehicle violates the aesthetic codes, the HOA can escalate the matter immediately to removal, especially if it's determined to reduce curb appeal for the entire community." I nearly bit through my tongue in frustration. That's nonsense. There's no mention in the official covenants, conditions, and restrictions about towing cars for being unaesthetic. I've read them more than once. "Well," Karen said, that smugness creeping back, "we introduced an addendum last month. It passed during an HOA board meeting, unanimous approval if I recall correctly. Maybe you should pay more attention to community updates." She let the sentence hang, implying that I was a negligent resident who deserved to have my car snatched away. "If you want the details, you can request them in writing. But let me be clear, the HOA is fully authorized to do this. I suggest you take it up with your insurance if you need compensation. Have a lovely day." Then she hung up. I stared at my phone in disbelief. The gall, first to hold a meeting that apparently no one else in the neighborhood even knew about, then to pass an addendum that allowed them to steal my property. This reeked of something more nefarious. My immediate plan was to gather any documentation I could find that proved the HOA had overstepped its legal boundaries. Now, Karen didn't know this, but I happened to be a lawyer, specializing primarily in property law and real estate. I rarely litigated, but I had more than enough knowledge and resources to go up against an out-of-control HOA. But before I delved into legal research, I wanted to gauge how widespread this madness was. Maybe other people in the neighborhood had experienced similar run-ins. After all, rumor had it that Karen's leadership style was ruthless and petty. I hopped into our local neighborhood social media group, the same place where people shared yard sale announcements or complained about missing pets. Sure enough, a handful of fresh posts popped up from folks complaining about ridiculous HOA enforcement. One man wrote about getting fined for having a decorative flamingo in his yard that clashed with the neighborhood color scheme. Another said she'd been threatened with a lien on her house for leaving a child's inflatable pool in her backyard, not visible from the street. On and on it went. Yet I saw no mention of anything as severe as towing cars from driveways, let alone selling them. I posted my own story, explaining what happened in neutral terms and asking if anyone else had dealt with similar draconian measures. Within minutes, the thread blew up. Dozens of neighbors expressed shock and outrage. Some swore they'd never heard a single word about these new vehicle guidelines. Others admitted they'd been threatened, but ended up paying petty fines to avoid bigger trouble. No one had heard of a complete seizure and sale of a vehicle. People demanded to know how and why Karen had done it so swiftly. Did she have a towing company on standby? Feeling validated but furious, I dove into the Homeowners Association bylaws, which I had saved on my computer. Over the years, I helped craft real estate documents, so reading legalese was second nature to me. Nothing I found legitimized Karen's claim to tow. Standard HOA rules about vehicles generally revolve around communal parking spaces, roads, or homeowner restrictions for large, rusted, or non-functional cars. But the mention of privately owned driveways is typically limited to ensuring they're not used for commercial or abandoned vehicles. My car was definitely none of those. Moreover, HOAs can't just whisk your property away without a due process. They must give written notices, hold a hearing, or at least provide a timeframe for you to rectify any alleged violation. This entire ordeal was blatantly outside the boundaries of typical association governance. Yet Karen didn't hesitate, which meant she was either incompetent or so brazen that she believed she could get away with anything. Maybe both. The next day, I reached out to the designated towing company. They informed me that yes, they had towed the car, and the HOA had authorized immediate disposal as junk. They even showed me a piece of paper Karen had signed, declaring the car not functional. The towing company claimed to have placed it on a fast-track auction list, something they typically reserve for truly abandoned, inoperable vehicles. The entire situation was so obviously corrupt that I had to resist the urge to start yelling at the poor guy on the phone. He was just a grunt doing what the HOA had told them. Karen's signature on that form was a brazen lie. I made up my mind right then and there. I was filing a lawsuit. It was one thing to feud over petty fines for mismatched paint colors, but seizing and selling someone's car with no notice is theft, plain and simple. I drafted a scathing demand letter, explaining that I was well aware of my rights, that I intended to pursue legal action if they didn't immediately rectify the situation, and that they'd be liable for the full value of my vehicle plus damages. I also requested a copy of any official meeting minutes or addendums that supposedly gave them this authority. Then I sent it via certified mail, email, and even dropped a copy off at the HOA office, just to be sure Karen wouldn't claim she never received it. A few days passed, and the only response I got was a curt email from the HOA's general inbox, saying that they would look into the matter. Meanwhile, my neighborhood post about the towing fiasco continued to blow up. Several neighbors recounted bizarre interactions with Karen, describing how she'd threatened to send them to collections for infractions like having an unapproved shade of roses in their garden or for hosting a weekend barbecue that supposedly generated too much smoke. This woman was unstoppable. People felt helpless because HOA boards often wield considerable power and the bureaucracy can be intimidating. Little did Karen know she'd actually messed with the worst possible person, someone who understood the law and had zero tolerance for bullies. My next step was to talk to neighbors face to face. I spent an entire Saturday strolling through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, introducing myself politely, and explaining what happened to me. To my surprise, quite a few people felt emboldened by my stance. They admitted they'd been scared to speak up, worried that Karen would escalate and impose bigger fines or find other ways to harass them. But once they learned a lawyer in the neighborhood was willing to stand up, their courage grew. They told me stories of random notices, threats, and the crazy fines they'd begrudgingly paid. One couple revealed that Karen demanded a $500 penalty because their mailbox post had chipped paint. Another woman said she was threatened with a lay-in because her dog was a breed that didn't fit the aesthetic of the community. It was madness. As I gathered these accounts, a disturbing pattern emerged. Karen was operating like a mini tyrant, using the HOA's authority to line the coffers with random fines or force people to comply with her personal whims. Many neighbors had no idea how the official process worked, so they assumed she was acting within her rights. But the truth was the opposite. Homeowners associations do have powers to maintain communal standards, but the extent of those powers is governed by state law, local statutes, and the association's own rules, none of which gave Karen carte blanche to run the place like her personal kingdom. I reached out to an acquaintance who worked at the county clerk's office, hoping to find out if Karen had even filed the addendum she boasted about. Typically, changes to HOA rules must be recorded in official records, or at least distributed properly to all members. Surprise, surprise, no such addendum was on file. So Karen had lied, claiming new guidelines existed when they didn't. it all started to make sense. She had probably realized how few homeowners would bother to check official records or question her word. Once I discovered that the law she referenced didn't exist, I felt an exhilarating sense of righteous anger. She had no ground to stand on. But what about the sale of my car? The towing lot insisted they'd followed instructions from the HOA. Someone had bought it, likely for a fraction of its market value, under the pretense that it was scrap. I was determined to hold someone accountable. The car was worth plenty of money, and I suspected whoever purchased it had no idea they were part of an illegal scheme, but I wasn't about to let the matter drop. The fact that it was gone and out of my reach only fueled my resolve to expose this entire fiasco. I filed a lawsuit against the HOA, naming Karen personally. The complaint detailed the unauthorized seizure of private property, fraud, misrepresentation, violation of consumer protection laws, and half a dozen other counts related to her blatant disregard for legal procedure. I asked the court for damages well beyond the value of my vehicle, factoring in emotional distress and punitive measures to discourage this behavior. From the neighbors who had suffered at Karen's hands, I gathered statements, building a mountain of evidence. By the time the summons reached the HOA office, there was no escaping it. They were forced to respond. In typical fashion, Karen tried to deflect. She publicly posted on the neighborhood forum, claiming I was harassing the HOA for personal gain. She wrote that one disgruntled homeowner is trying to dismantle the harmony we've built, painting herself as a champion of uniformity and cleanliness. But at that point, the tide had already turned. By now, half the community had read my meticulously detailed post or talked to me directly. People realized she was lying through her teeth about these new guidelines. Karen tried damage control, claiming she had a strong legal team that would prove I was in the wrong, but I could see the cracks forming. Neighbors started calling her out publicly, telling their own stories of being bullied or threatened over minor infractions. The forum lit up like a Christmas tree with outraged comments demanding she resign. She tried to clamp down on dissent, threatening to ban people from the group or impose yet more fines for defamation of the HOA. But that only fanned the flames. People were done with her nonsense. I got phone calls from other attorneys in town, curious about the case, wondering if they could help. The local news even caught wind of it, sniffing out a story about a rogue HOA that was seizing people's vehicles. A reporter emailed me to ask for a statement, and I gave a careful but firm explanation. Our association's leadership has abused their power in unprecedented ways, towing and auctioning off vehicles with no legal basis. We're pursuing justice through the courts, and we hope to restore a sense of fairness to our neighborhood. The story went live on a Tuesday evening, and the next day, I saw a news van idling by the neighborhood's entrance, filming segments for the evening broadcast. That definitely put Karen on edge. In response, Karen tried to shut down the scandal by calling for an urgent HOA meeting to address the troublemakers. She posted notes on every door, giving people 2 days' notice to attend the meeting at the community center. Usually these meetings were sparsely attended, maybe 10 or 15 people. This time the place was packed. I arrived to find a standing room-only crowd, everyone murmuring with tension. Karen sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 2 other board members who looked more nervous than loyal. She hammered a gavel, calling the meeting to order like she was presiding over a high court. Then she launched into a speech about how the HOA had tried to maintain the highest standards, how certain rebellious elements were undermining the community, and how we should trust her leadership. Normally, a lot of folks in that room might have been cowed or indifferent, but the events of the past weeks had galvanized them. One by one, neighbors stood up and recounted their experiences. They weren't letting Karen dominate the narrative. People talked about the random fines, the threats, the intimidation. Some were near tears, describing the financial strain or emotional distress. Karen tried to brush them off, but it was impossible. By the time I took the floor, the crowd was already leaning heavily against her. I laid out the facts, that my car, legally parked on my own property, had been towed and sold with no due process. That no valid record existed of any new bylaw authorizing such an action. That I, as a property lawyer, had found more than enough evidence to show the HOA was operating illegally under Karen's watch. Then I read from a letter the local tow authority provided, confirming the lot had received orders from the HOA claiming my car was junk. Furious gasps rippled through the room. People realized how blatant the lie was. My new sedan was the opposite of junk, and most residents had seen me driving it daily. Karen tried to interrupt, waving her arms in exasperation, but the crowd wasn't having it. When she insisted she had every right, someone yelled, "Prove it." She fumbled for a moment, then said the documents were confidential. That triggered an uproar. HOA documents regarding community regulations aren't confidential. They're public to all members of the association. People started calling for her resignation then and there. Never one to admit defeat gracefully, Karen pressed on, claiming that she had the majority's support, that the board had voted on everything she did. But as she looked to her fellow board members, one of them, a timid older woman named Carol, swallowed hard and spoke up, her voice shaking as she said they were never allowed to see or vote on any new vehicle guidelines. She alleged Karen often made executive decisions and only told the board after the fact. Another board member chimed in, saying he'd tried to raise questions but was shut down. The room went wild. People demanded accountability. It became clear that Karen had been running a one-woman show, forging addendums, sending out fines, and orchestrating tows entirely on her own. The board was just window dressing. Sensing the mutiny, Karen slammed her gavel, declared the meeting adjourned, and tried to storm out. But the crowd blocked her path, nearly cornering her with furious questions. A few local reporters who had slipped in at the back snapped photos while neighbors peppered her with demands. "Why did you take my money for a chipped mailbox if there's no bylaw about that? Where's the form I supposedly signed agreeing to these new rules?" She couldn't answer. Security eventually had to escort her out for her own safety, though no one was physically threatening her, just verbally outraged. In the days that followed, the HOA board met without Karen's presence and voted unanimously to remove her as president. They cited a complete violation of trust and ethical standards. Meanwhile, my lawsuit trudged forward. Karen tried to find a lawyer to defend her personally, but from what I heard, no reputable attorney wanted to take on such a blatantly losing case. She ended up with a small-time attorney who seemed out of his depth. With all the evidence stacked against her, the best they could do was stall the court date, hoping to delay the inevitable. But they could only stall so much. When we finally got to a hearing, it was a small circus. My testimony was concise. I explained that I'd parked my car in my driveway, that I had no prior notice or violation letters, that my car was well maintained, that the HOA forcibly towed it under the false pretense of being junk, and that it had been sold within hours, something that defied standard protocols. Then I unveiled a timeline showing precisely how Karen had lied. We had digital logs from the towing company, text messages from neighbors who witnessed the tow, and the official record from the county that no such vehicle addendum had been filed. By the time I finished, the judge looked thoroughly unimpressed with Karen's side. When Karen took the stand, she hemmed and hawed, tried to blame everyone else, claimed the board had authorized it, then changed her story to claim I'd received multiple warnings. I produced screenshots from my email confirming I never got anything from the HOA about my car, and the judge practically scowled at her for the conflicting accounts. Not surprisingly, the judge ruled in my favor. Karen was held personally liable for damages, which included the value of my car plus additional compensation for the emotional and logistical nightmare she'd created. But it didn't end there. Once word got out that Karen had orchestrated multiple questionable towing incidents, albeit not as extreme as mine, more lawsuits piled up. A group of neighbors banded together in a class action suit, alleging fraudulent fines and other petty charges Karen had imposed. The new HOA board cooperated fully, providing all internal documents. They wanted a clean slate. Karen, on the other hand, faced a deluge of legal actions she clearly couldn't handle. In the end, she declared bankruptcy to manage the mounting judgments against her. As for the neighborhood, we got a fresh start. The new board revised the bylaws to ensure residents received transparent notices, real warnings, and a fair chance to address any legitimate concerns. They replaced the petty fines with a more lenient approach aimed at genuine community improvement. In that environment, neighborly relations flourished. People started organizing block parties, helping each other with home improvement projects, and collectively deciding what mattered in terms of aesthetic standards. No longer did we live in fear of an overnight ambush from a tow truck. My own sense of closure came months later, when I finally received the full restitution from the court's judgment, including an additional sum for punitive damages. With that money, I replaced the car that was stolen from me. This time, I opted for a slightly nicer model, one Karen would definitely labeled unaesthetic just to be spiteful. It gave me an odd sense of satisfaction to park that new car in my driveway, right where the old one had been towed, reminding myself that justice had prevailed. Karen, on the other hand, ended up selling her house. She couldn't remain in a neighborhood that despised her or keep paying lawyers to fight losing battles. Rumor had it that she moved to another city, or maybe another state altogether, looking for a fresh start where no one knew about her fiasco. No one really kept tabs on her. We were just glad she was gone, taking her toxicity with her. It's been said that power corrupts, and for Karen, that might have been the perfect example. She started off with the authority to ensure the neighborhood looked decent, keep property values stable, and make sure everyone was living in harmony. But she let it go to her head, turning the HOA into her own personal tool of intimidation. By the time she towed my car, it wasn't even about the car. It was about feeding her desire to rule without opposition. She never expected a legal battle to blow up in her face. She misjudged the quiet neighbor who happened to be a lawyer, and she certainly never foresaw that her entire empire of petty fines and secret rules would crumble beneath her. That's the story of how my HOA Karen tried to get away with literally stealing my car and ended up losing everything. If you found this saga as shocking as I did, or if you've dealt with a similar nightmare, please like this video, drop a comment about your own experiences, and subscribe to Taleflow for more mind-blowing tales of HOA drama and comeuppance. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these stories flowing. Because as long as there are Karens in the world, you'd better believe there will be stories about them crossing the line and paying the price. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video.